The idea with the hero's journey is that there is an arc that is typically defined in three different stages or three different categories. And here's where I think you'll start to see the tie-in to psychedelic experiences. So those three categories are departure, initiation, and return. And so when we're dissecting the hero's journey, it's a really, really fascinating, process. But the idea is that there's a protagonist and they are, against great odds. They have a call to adventure. They are potentially supported by supernatural forces or have supernatural aid. They cross beyond some sort of a threshold where they may have to defeat some guardians or demons. They then go into a descent almost, transform in some way, and then return back to their communities or their societies to defeat the enemy and bring their gifts to the world. And so sometimes when we're talking about the categories of departure, initiation, and return, sometimes that's actually broken down into four categories, which is separation, descent, initiation, and return. And now you all know that our organization is called Psychedelic Passage. One of the reasons being is that psychedelics can actually serve as this really important and beautiful process of rites of passage. So the hero's journey aligns, right with that as well. I think that we see this in so many different examples. Basically, this is why we love the underdog. This is why we love comeback stories. This is why we love Rocky, right? The movies. The idea is that there is something embedded within our human nature that allows us to identify with these processes and with these characters, whether fiction or nonfiction, who go through this. It's just something that we are familiar with and inherently know and understand in human nature. And so when I think about that, I'm like, yeah, that's a perfect description of some of my own psychedelic experiences. You are consuming a psychedelic substance, you depart, you go on this fantastical experience, some of which folks describe it can be supernatural in nature, and you often return transformed in some type of way. Whether that transformation is long-standing or not, obviously depends on other things like preparation and integration, other mindfulness work around psychedelics. And so I think it's actually very well intentioned around coining this phrase, the heroic dose, because I maintain that anytime you are choosing to look in your inner landscape and potentially face your inner demons or your own challenging content, that in itself is an act of bravery. And that in itself is an act of heroism, regardless of whether you feel it at the time. There's so many people who are suffering so much that sometimes that experience of suffering can actually overshadow the really brave things that people are doing to find healing and find connection and return back to their world. And then I think the other limitation and drawback of the hero's journey is that it is somewhat of a rather simplistic, or what they call sometimes a sympathetic plot. And the sequence usually goes like this. The protagonist is goal-oriented, they face obstacles, they overcome the obstacles, and they get a reward. And unfortunately, healing is not that simple or linear. It can include some of these processes, but I also find healing to be nonlinear. I also find the healing process to be dynamic. Your needs and your idea of progress changes and shifts over time. Healing is also so dependent upon community and care and, social determinants. There's so many factors that play into it. And one of the things that I try to dispel when individuals are, wanting to explore psychedelics for their own, therapeutic, purpose or healing purpose, is that there can be this notion of having to do it the right way. That there's a specific, defined, regimented way of exploring psychedelics. And then, of course, the heroic dose is a big influencer in that. And so, the other way that I look at how the heroic dose is shaped by our own cultural and societal context is that we are also a society here in America where bigger is better and more is always superior than less. And those notions don't always apply to the deeply nuanced process of trying to find healing through psychedelic use. So I talked a little bit about some of the, I think, beautiful things about the hero's journey and then also some drawbacks. So to draw a parallel to this, to the notion of the heroic dose, I also think that there are some pros and cons to thinking about the heroic dose. When I imagine what it would have been like back in the 60s, and if I happen to be so lucky to have Terence McKenna talk to me about a heroic dose, I imagine that maybe my only psychedelic experiences at the time would have been possibly through a social context. It might have possibly been through a, party or, euphoric context. I might have explored psychedelics back at that time to enjoy listening to music. Maybe I would have, had some thought-provoking, soul-enhancing discoveries during those experiences. But if somebody then told me about doing a large dose, limiting external stimuli, and actually turning and facing myself internally, I think that that would have been a pretty groundbreaking and novel idea at the time. I think the other part about the heroic dose, in general, my piece of criticism about the heroic dose is that it puts therapeutic psychedelic work in kind of this container or a box that says it has to be this, otherwise it's not going to work, right? And I think that talking about the heroic dose also puts a lot of emphasis on dosage in itself. I also think, as I mentioned, Terence McKenna wasn't like the most celebrated for harm reduction principles, but the heroic dose really denotes this idea of just like white knuckling the experience. And that could lead to folks not asking for help. That could lead to folks not seeking the right care. That could lead to a lot of issues with, the lack of support around psychedelic experiences.